In this video, I'm going to discuss Bible chronology. There have been several attempts throughout history by some famous people to determine the creation of the earth according to the Bible. Perhaps some of the most famous attempts are Bishop Ussher, who came up with the year 4004 BC as the date of creation. Other famous attempts include those by Johann Kepler, who's the father of the laws of planetary motion. He came up with a date of 3993 BC. And of course, another famous chronologist is Sir Isaac Newton, who came up with a creation date of 3988 BC. But what we can see from these attempts is that roughly the age of the Earth, according to most people who've looked into this, is around 4,000 years BC for the date of creation. Now, I'm going to give you my Bible chronology and my study in the subject and what I believe the scriptures show as the proper chronology. And I came up with a date of 3967 BC. Now, what advantage do I have over mental giants such as Kepler or Sir Isaac Newton? Well, the internet, for one thing. I have the advantage of being able to have access to sources that people didn't have back in the 1600s and 1500s. And so that makes a big difference in being able to research this subject. I'm going to show you why I believe that 3967 BC is the correct date according to the scriptures and what that means for Bible prophecy as well as Bible chronology. So let's start with talking about what I think are 14 key puzzle pieces that we can use to weave together the proper chronology of the Bible. So our first puzzle piece is actually a rather easy one to figure out. It's the year of the flood from the time of creation according to the scriptures. To do that, all we have to do is read Genesis chapter 5, which gives the ages of the patriarchs from the time of creation until the birth of Noah. From this, we can easily add up the years and determine that the birth of Noah was 1,056 years after creation. Now, for the sake of time, I won't read through the entire chapter of Genesis 5 and add up those numbers for you. You can certainly do that in your own time, but just take my word for it that when you add those figures up, it does give a birth year of Noah as 1,056 years after creation. Additionally, in Genesis chapter 7, verse 6, we see that Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters were upon the earth. So by adding 600 years to the year of his birth being 1,056 after creation, we come up with a flood year of 1,656 years after creation. So that puzzle piece is very simple to put together. The next puzzle piece is simple as well. This puzzle piece is the birth year for Arphaxad, who is the son of Shem, the son of Noah. Now, according to Genesis chapter 11, verse 10, it says that Arphaxad was born to Shem 2 years after the flood. So it's a very simple puzzle piece. The flood year is the year 1656 after creation. We add 2 years, and we come up with a birth year of Arphaxad of the year 1658 after the flood. Very simple. The reason why I'm including this puzzle piece isn't so much to show the additional 2 years, because I could have simply added that on to the last puzzle piece, but the more important part that I wanted to show is that Shem is actually the youngest child chronologically in order of birth. You see, in Genesis 6:10, we read, "And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth." Now, if we took this as a chronological reading, it would seem to indicate that Shem is the oldest son. However, this is not possible. In the prior chapter, in Genesis 5, verse 32, it reads, "And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth." So again, this would seem to indicate that Noah was 500 when Shem was born, but I'll show you why that's not possible. In Genesis verse 21 of chapter 10, we read, "Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born." So we can see that Japheth is older than Shem. Additionally, we read in Genesis chapter 11, verse 10, that these are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Now, if you recall, Noah was 500 when he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So if Shem was 100 years old when he begat Arphaxad, he should have had Arphaxad the year of the flood, not 2 years after, because he would have been 100 when Noah was 600, and that's when the floodwaters were upon the earth. Therefore, Shem must have been born when Noah was 502, which means that he probably had Japheth when he was 500, then he had Ham when he was 501, and then Shem when he was 502, because Japheth is the elder. So I want you to remember this puzzle piece type when we get to Abraham, because you'll see the same type of thing play out with Abraham. Just because somebody is listed first in the scriptures in the order of names doesn't mean that they were the firstborn, and the Bible can explain that by subsequent verses. So remember that when we get to Abraham. But let's move on to our next puzzle piece. Now this is where things really start to get a little more tricky. This puzzle piece is called the Age of Arphaxad, when Cainan was born. Now most of you might think of Cainan as Cainan the son of Ham, but this is not the same Cainan I'm talking about. That's a different Cainan. This Cainan, the son of Arphaxad, is only listed in the New Testament, but if you open up your Old Testament, you won't find him in Genesis. Why is that? And more importantly, which chronology is correct? The New Testament version or the Old Testament version? So we're going to examine that problem right now. So in Luke chapter 3, verse 35, we are picking up a chronology that's being given in this chapter. We'll start off with this verse and saying that so-and-so, which was the son of Sarug, which was the son of Regau, which was the son of Peleg, which was the son of Eber, which was the son of Salah, which was the son of Cainan. There's our missing Cainan, which was the son of Arphaxad. So in the Old Testament, this Cainan figure is not there. It goes right from Arphaxad to Salah. We'll take a look at that now. So here we see in Genesis chapter 11, verse 13, it says, "And Arphaxad lived after he begat Salah 403 years and begat sons and daughters." In verse 12 it says, "And Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Salah." Okay, so there's no mention of Cainan. It makes it appear as though Arphaxad is the father of Salah, and that Salah is his son, not his grandson, which is what Luke makes it look like. So which is correct? Is Luke correct, or is Genesis correct? Well, it gets a little more complicated than just that. You see, there's some ancient texts that do list Cainan as the son of Arphaxad in the Old Testament, particularly a text called the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is a Greek translation that was made of the Old Testament roughly a couple centuries before the time of Christ, because most of the people in that day and age spoke Greek rather than Hebrew, and so therefore it was very important to have a Greek copy of the Old Testament, because that was the lingua franca of that day. So that Greek translation did list Cainan as the son of Arphaxad. So why is it not in our modern Bibles? Our modern Bibles are based on something called the Masoretic text, and some of the earliest versions we have of the Masoretic text, such as the Leningrad Codex, don't go back nearly as far as texts such as the Septuagint. So how is it that Cainan disappeared out of the Masoretic text if it was ever there in the first place? That's a good question. We do know that this figure of Cainan, the son of Arphaxad, does appear in certain other ancient non-biblical texts. For example, there's a non-canonical book called the Book of Jubilees, which gives a story about Cainan, the son of Arphaxad, as having discovered astronomy and astrology after the time of the flood. So it may be possible that because Cainan was dabbling in things such as astrology, that he was considered accursed, and that his name may have been purposefully blotted out. Or it may have something to do with the curse of the other Cainan, the Cainan that's the son of Ham, that's listed earlier in the book, also in the book of Genesis, that somehow this gets attributed to Cainan, the son of Arphaxad, and therefore his name is purposely blotted out of the book because he was accursed. This is a possibility, but for whatever reason, whether it's simply a clerical error that Cainan was added in the first place, or whether he was purposefully omitted in the Masoretic text over time so that we no longer have that name listed, either way, there is evidence historically that Cainan was in ancient texts listed as the son of Arphaxad in copies of the Old Testament. So, because the Septuagint shows this, let's take a look at what the Septuagint would indicate as the proper chronology for the birth year of Cainan, son of Arphaxad. So what we see in this chart is a list of 3 ancient versions of the Old Testament. The first column is based on the Masoretic and the Vulgate. The second column is based on the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is another ancient version of the Old Testament. And the third column is the aforementioned Septuagint version. Now, we notice that both the Masoretic and the Samaritan Pentateuch do not list Cainan in the chronology, whereas the Septuagint version does list Cainan in the chronology. In addition to that, if we look at the birth years in the Septuagint that are given for the patriarchs, they generally tend to add 100 years to the Masoretic version, as does the Samaritan Pentateuch. So, if we were going to look at what Canaan's birth year would have been, or how old Cainan would have been at the time that his son was born, Salah, based on the Masoretic version, all we would really have to do is take the Septuagint version and subtract that 100 years. That would mean that most likely, if Cainan was listed in the Masoretic, he probably would have been 30 years old at the time of the birth of Salah. And so therefore, what we can see, if we plug Cainan in that fashion, that Arphaxad was 35 years old when he begot Cainan, and Cainan was 30 years old when he begot Salah. We do this again by simply taking the Septuagint numbers and subtracting 100, because they appear to add 100 to the Masoretic text. Now, that's a radical decision, but I found that by actually applying that to the chronology, it tends to make everything else work. So we're going to go with that and see how it plays out as we go on with our chronology. But I tend to think that the New Testament version is the correct chronology. That in fact, where the New Testament says that Cainan is the son of Arphaxad and the father of Salah, that is true. And that if we use the Septuagint years in a Masoretic way, we can come up with the correct year for the birth year of Salah, son of Cainan. So let's go back to our puzzle pieces. So therefore, using this methodology, what we arrive at for our third puzzle piece is the age of Arphaxad when Cainan was born was 35 years. Prior to that, we had the age of Salah when at the time, or the age of Arphaxad at the time Salah was born as 35 years. But because we're plugging Cainan in, it now becomes the age of Arphaxad at the time that Cainan was born as 35 years. So by adding our prior date, which was the age of number of years since creation at the time of the birth of Arphaxad as 1658, now by adding that additional 35 years, we've come to the year 1693 since creation. So 1693 years is the year that Cainan, son of Arphaxad, was born after creation. Now let's move on to puzzle piece number 4. And again, puzzle piece number 4, we already kind of just went through the numbers for that one, but that's the age of Cainan now when Salah was born. And as we saw from what we were looking at with the Septuagint, by applying it to the Masoretic text, we came up with an age of 30 years. So if Cainan was 30 years old when Salah was born, based on Genesis 11 and 12, verse 12 in the Septuagint, and Luke 3, verse 35 and 36, we come up with a total time frame of 1723 years after creation for the age of Cainan when Salah was born. That's 1693 years from his birth to plus 30 years for the time of the birth of Salah, his age at the time of birth of Salah. So 1723 years is where we're at now with our puzzle piece number 4. So let's now move on to puzzle piece number 5. Now, puzzle piece number 5 is another easy puzzle piece. It's basically adding up the dates of the ages of the patriarchs in Genesis chapter 5. Now again, we're starting from where we left off, which was with the birth of Salah, okay? And then if we add that all the way up to the age of the birth of Haran, we get a total of 255 years. I won't go through that, but you can go into Genesis chapter 11 and add it up for yourself if you wish to. The numbers are all there, and it's very straightforward. So there's 255 years that brings us to the birth of Haran. And that gives us a total time frame of 1,978 years now after creation. That's how far we are along in our chronology. Now, I want to look at that verse real quick, because if you remember earlier, I talked about that discrepancy with Shem, Ham, and Japheth as far as who was the firstborn. The same thing is happening here with the birth of Haran and the birth of Abraham and Nahor. We read in verse 26 of Genesis chapter 11, and Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So one could look at that and think that Abraham is the firstborn and the eldest, and that they're all roughly born at the same time. However, as we go through our chronology, we find out that this is not actually the case. That in fact, either Haran or Nahor would have to be the eldest, and Abraham would have to be, or Abram would have to be the youngest. Now, I tend to believe that it's Haran that's the oldest, because the city that they end up moving to is named for Haran, and Haran died before they ended up going further in their trip towards Canaan. So that being said, because the city was named after him, I tend to think that he was probably the oldest. But it says in verse 27, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot, and Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, Ur of the Chaldees. Okay, so how do we know that Abram is not the oldest? Because we did see that play out with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. How do we know the same thing is happening here? Well, let's take a look. In the book of Acts, in chapter 7, Stephen is giving a speech moved by the Holy Spirit shortly before his martyrdom. And his speech begins very, very passionately, but it states the following. It says in chapter 7, verse 2, and he said to the men, brethren and fathers, hearken. The glory of the God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said unto him, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come to the land which I shall show thee. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Haran. And from thence, when his father was dead, keep that in mind, when his father was dead, he removed him from this into this land wherein ye now dwell, being the land of Canaan or Israel. So Abraham left Haran to go to the land of Canaan, which is now Israel, when his father was dead. But let's look at the Old Testament version. Now, remember that in Genesis 11, verse 26, it says that Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. But if we go down to verse 32, it says, and the days of Terah were 205 years, and he died in Haran. So he was 70 when he began having children. He was 205 when he died. Okay, keep that in mind as we look at the next verse. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, it says, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Okay, so there's a little bit of a problem here, because if Terah was 70 when he begat Haran, Nahor, and Abram, and Terah died at 205, and Abram left when he was 75 years old, then Terah should have been 145 at the time of his death, because Abram left when his father died, according to what we just read in the book of Acts. But we also just saw that Terah was 205, not 145 when he died. So what's going on here? If Abraham leaves the city of Haran to go into Canaan when he's 75 years old, and when Terah is 145 years old, and Terah's still going to live many more decades, then the father that died, that's being talked about by Stephen in the book of Acts, cannot be his father Terah. You see, the Hebrew word father doesn't necessarily mean your immediate father. It's very much used in Scripture where the word father can mean any of your patriarchs or lineage. So it could be your father, your grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, and so on and so forth. For example, Jesus is referred to as the son of David, or the son of man, or the son of Adam. Okay, he's not the direct immediate son, but it's very common in the Scriptures when it talks about the word father to not mean necessarily an immediate father, but it could mean your father somewhere up the line. Okay, your great-great-great-grandfather, or so forth. So whichever father that Stephen is talking about that died at the time that Abraham left Haran to go to the land of Canaan, it couldn't have been Terah, because Terah wouldn't die for several decades later. So it must be a different patriarch, a different father of Abraham further up the line that passed away at the time he left at the age of 75. So let's take a look at our chronology. Now, I've taken the time to plot out my entire chronology onto a spreadsheet so that I can see it in basically one glance. And I can tell you that without actually going through and adding up all the patriarchs, just to keep it simple for the sake of time for this video, that if we look at the listing of the ages of the patriarchs given in Genesis chapter 11, we can see that the father that dies at the time Abraham is 75 is Reu. And you can do this simply by looking at the ages of the patriarchs. They're very forthright given in Genesis chapter 11, okay? And then comparing that to the age of Abraham at the time that he went into Canaan, which was age 75. And we can see that it matches perfectly to the death year of Reu. So the time that Abraham left at age 75 to go into the land of Canaan when his father died has to be the father Reu, based on my chronology. Okay. However, that only works if Abraham is the third-born son, because Terah is 7 years old when he has Haran and Nahor and Abraham. So just like Shem, Ham, and Japheth, if Abraham is the third-born son, that places the time that he leaves Haran to go into Canaan as exactly the same year that Reu dies. If he's the firstborn, then we're 2 years early on the death of Reu. So it doesn't work. It only works if Abraham is the third-born son. But it has to be the case because none of the other patriarchs die anywhere near around the time that Abraham was 75 years old. So therefore, based on this chronology, it has to be Reu, who is the father that dies at the time Abraham goes to Canaan. In addition to that, Abraham has to be the third-born in the same way that we saw that Shem was the third-born with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So that's an important part, an important key in our chronology puzzle. So our puzzle piece number 6 is that Abraham was born 2 years after Haran, according to Genesis chapter 11, verses 26 and 32, and also Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, and Acts chapter 7, verse 4. So now where are we at on our creation chronology? We have 2 years added to the birth of Haran, to the birth of Abraham, which gives us 1978 plus 2, so we are at 1980 years after creation for the birth of Abraham. Now, puzzle piece 7 is another kind of straightforward, easier puzzle piece. Basically, we just need to worry about these 3 particular verses. Genesis 21, verse 5, Genesis 25, verse 26, and Genesis chapter 47, verses 8 through 9. So this deals with the time from the birth of Abraham until when Jacob enters into Egypt. And so we have a time period there of 290 years. We can see that easily because Genesis 21 verse 5 shows that Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. 25 verse 26 shows that Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. And Genesis 47 verses 8 through 9 shows that Jacob was 130 at the time that he went into Egypt. So we add that all up and we get a total of 290 years. So we add that to our prior 1980 years that we are at in our chronological time frame. And now we are at a time period of 2,270 years after creation for the time that Jacob goes into Egypt. So that one's pretty straightforward. We're about halfway through our puzzle pieces. Let's go on to the next one. So this one is another tricky one, and this one is one that's very much been debated throughout time. And the question is, how long were the Israelites in Egypt before the Exodus? So I'm going to submit to you that the time frame that they were in Egypt was 300 years, and that I can prove that from Scripture. Now, if you look at a lot of old movies, like the famous Ten Commandments movie with Charlton Heston, or many other older documents and so forth, the figure seems to keep coming up time and time again that the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt for 400 years. But that is simply not the case, and that's not what the Bible says. That's a misunderstanding of what the Bible says that's been carried down throughout time, and it's gotten repeated over and over again that the Israelites were in bondage for 400 years. But that is not true, and I can prove it. First of all, in Genesis 46, verse 11, it indicates that one of the sons of Levi, by the name of Kohath, was one of the individuals that went with Jacob into Egypt. Okay, now he may have been a baby at the time, but he was one of the family members of Jacob that's listed as going into Egypt with Jacob. And then in Exodus chapter 6, we have lists of the ages of Kohath up to the time of his death, and then the age of his son up to the time of his death, and so on and so forth, until we get down to Moses. So when you add up all the dates for the ages from the time that Kohath went into Egypt for those generations all the way up to Moses, suffice to say that when you look at what's given in Exodus chapter 6, you can only come up with a time frame maximum of 350 years before Moses leads them out of Egypt in the Exodus. So it is impossible that they could have been in Egypt for 400 years because the scriptures just don't allow for that. So why do people keep repeating or thinking this idea that the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt for 400 years? That comes from a specific prophecy given in Genesis chapter 15, through verses 13 through 16. It gets misapplied to being referred to as the time that the Israelites were in Egypt. So let's go ahead and read those verses now so you can see how it gets misapplied. So what this is a famous part of the Bible where God is making a covenant with Abraham. And the covenant that he's making in Genesis chapter 15 is called the covenant of the parts. I won't go into that in this video, but basically suffice to say there's an animal sacrifice that takes place, and Abraham goes into a kind of a deep sleep, but God comes to him and he says a prophecy over Abraham, what's going to happen to him and his offspring after him. And then the covenant takes place where Abraham falls asleep and he sees this vision of or an image of a burning lamp that's traveling between the pieces of the animals and so forth. But, that's for another story. So I'm going to read to you the verses of what God gives as a prophecy to Abraham about him and his descendants. And this is where they get the 400 years from. So in Genesis chapter 15, verse 12, it says, "And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abraham," this is God speaking, "and he said unto Abraham, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Okay? So that's where people are applying that to the time in Egypt. That they believe, that must be talking about when they're in Egypt. They're going to be in bondage for 400 years. Not necessarily the case. Okay? So let's continue on with the prophecy. And it says, "And also that nation whom they shall serve I will judge, and afterward they shall come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age, but in the 4th generation they shall come hither again for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So let's look at these verses a little bit more carefully. Okay? What are the sequence of events here? First, God says that Abraham's seed will be a stranger in a land that's not theirs and will serve them, and they will be afflicted by them for 400 years. And the nation that they serve, that God's going to judge that nation, but that afterward they will come out with great substance. Okay? And then at some point in time, Abraham's going to die. It says, "You shall go to your fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age." And it says, "But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again." In other words, they shall come back, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So let's look at verse 14. It says, they're going to serve a nation, and they're going to come out of that nation with great substance. But verse 16 says that 4 generations later, they're going to come back. Okay? So they're coming out of a nation with great substance, disappearing for 4 generations, and then coming back. So the nation that they served, that they were afflicted by, is not the nation that they were in for the 4 generations. It's the nation that they came out of before they disappeared for 4 generations and then came back. Okay? So this can only apply to, in the Bible, the story of Laban. All right? Because Jacob went to get a wife from back in the old country in Padan Aram, and when he gets there, Laban, he meets Laban, who has a couple of daughters, and one of them Jacob finds very beautiful, and he agrees to work and serve Laban for 7 years in exchange for the hand of his daughter. However, Laban does this little switcheroo and gives him the wrong daughter, and so Jacob ends up agreeing to serve another 7 years for the other daughter. And then he does some more hanky-panky, and he ends up having to serve another 6 years for some livestock. So it all ends up being like he spends 20 years in basically bondage and slavery at the hands of Laban. In addition to that, because of the trickery that Laban did, where he basically tricked Jacob into marrying 2 wives, you see in the naming of his children, they give them names of affliction, okay, at least the first few children, indicating that they were suffering from affliction, okay? And so this is the affliction that's being talked about. This is the start of the affliction. This starts the whole problem for Jacob. And this affliction will not end until Jacob gets his own land, because until he gets his own land, he's merely a sojourner, and his offspring are merely sojourners in land that is not theirs. So knowing that, let's read the prophecy again, because when Jacob finally does leave from the hand of Laban, God blesses him and allows him to leave with a great substance, with a great number of the flock of Laban, before he disappears to go into Egypt. And then we also know from Exodus chapter 6 that it is 4 generations that they spend in Egypt before they come back again. So knowing that, let's read this prophecy again. It says, "And he said unto Abraham, Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them and afflict them 400 years. Okay? It will be 400 years from the time the affliction starts, with Jacob getting his wives from Laban, to the year when they finally get the land in Israel under Joshua. Okay? Because they spend 300 years in Egypt. They spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. They spend 7 years conquering the land once they get in there, and then they're divvied up. That's 357 years. That divvies up the land. Well, if you count from the time that Jacob went to get his wives at age 77, and that's a little more I can go into detail when I show you some of the charts that I've done. Basically, that all adds up to exactly 400 years. So Jacob and his descendants are a sojourner for exactly 400 years, and that's what this prophecy is saying. It says, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that's not theirs, and shall serve them, and shall afflict them 400 years, and also the nation whom they will serve I will judge, and afterwards they will come out with great substance." This means coming out from Laban, okay? The judgment was on Laban and the Babylonians, and the Arameans and so forth. Jacob and his family left Laban with great substance, and then disappeared for 4 generations down into Egypt, and then came back in the 4th generation in the Exodus. So in verse 16 it says, but in the 4th generation they shall come back again. So they come out with great substance, they're gone for 4 generations, and they come back again. So the 400 years being talked about is not talking about 400 years in Egypt. As I said earlier, you can see that's impossible from the years given for the generations from Kohath down to Moses, that there's a maximum of 350 years. Okay, so it can only apply to this time frame, from the time that Jacob goes into bondage with serving Laban to the time that they're no longer sojourners in a land that's not theirs, so the time they actually get their land, which is the 7th year after they enter the land under Joshua and conquer it. Okay, and that's something that I can show in another, in the book of Judges, how that's the case as well. But when you add up all those years, it's exactly 400 years. So that's the time of affliction. Okay, but how do we then know that they were in Egypt for 300 years? We know it's not 400, as we just shown. How do we know that they're in Egypt for 300 years? So for this, we have to look at the book of Galatians, because this gives us the answer. So in the book of Galatians, Paul is making a very astute argument. Okay, he's basically saying that salvation does not come from the works of the law of Moses. That salvation comes from faith, and that he proves that salvation is the covenant of faith, if you will, cannot be undone by the covenant of the law under Moses, because the covenant of faith was earlier. All right, and he's talking about this covenant that was made with Abraham, the one we just read where the prophecy was given. Okay, so Paul says, "Brethren, I speak after the manner of men, though it be a man's covenant, yet if it be confirmed, no man disannulleth or addeth thereto. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ." And then we pick it up in verse 17. It says, And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect. Okay, so here's where this gets kind of complicated, where a lot of people misunderstand this. The law that they're talking about here, that's 430 years afterward, that's obviously the law of Moses. It's the law that was given at Mount Sinai at the time of the Exodus. Okay, so if that law was given 430 years after, the question is, after what? So some people think that means after the covenant that was made with Abraham. Okay, but this can't be the case, because if you look at a careful reading of the text, it says he's talking about the seed of Abraham, and he's talking about the confirmation of the covenant, and that once the covenant's confirmed, no man can add or disannul to it. It's like once it's in place, it's in place. You can't undo it. You can't unring the bell, so to speak, right? So he says, "Brethren, I speak after," in verse 15, "Brethren, I speak after the manner of men, though it be a man's covenant, yet if it be confirmed, no man disannul or addeth thereto." So what's the covenant that he made? It's the promise of a promised seed to Abraham. Okay, that's the covenant. So once that seed comes, once that seed arrives on the scene, then the covenant's been confirmed. It's like, here it is. What he promised, he brings to pass. Okay? So the appearance, the arrival of this seed is the confirmation of that covenant. Okay? And that's what Paul's talking about here. He says, "Brethren, I speak to you after the manner of men, though it be a man's covenant, yet if it be confirmed, no man disannulleth or addeth thereto." Now, to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not to seeds as of many, but as of one, to thy seed, which is Christ, which can also mean anointed. It doesn't necessarily have to mean Jesus Christ. It can mean like the anointed seed. But here's another indicator why it's talking about his anointed seed being the promised seed, the promised heir of Abraham before the covenant of Moses. It says in verse 17, And I say this, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, okay, before what? Before the Exodus, okay? So the Christian seed that we're talking about here, the specific anointed seed that we're talking about, and we're saying seed, not seeds, not many, but one seed, one person, is somebody who came before the Exodus in Egypt. Okay, so it says, and I say this, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promise of none effect. Okay, so who is this anointed seed? Well, there's only one possibility. The promised seed that would get the land is Israel, is Jacob. Okay, and he said not, and he makes the argument here. He says the promise was made to his seed, and not to seeds as of many, but to one seed, and to that one seed, which is the anointed seed, which in this case we're talking about Israel. Okay. And the reason why he's making this argument, saying not to seeds, but as of one seed, he's talking about the specific promised child, if you will, that was born. Because we can see that this can refer to a specific nation, because later on he says that, let's see, hang on one second here. For you're all children of God by faith in Jesus Christ. Okay? In verse 29 it says, and if ye be Christ's, then ye are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Not seeds and seeds. So what does that mean? It means that you're part of this promised nation. Okay? You're part of that promised seed. So a seed can be many people, but it's one particular nation. Okay? And that nation starts with Jacob. It starts with Israel. All right? And then, so what we're talking about here is the birth of Jacob, the birth of Israel. That's the confirmation of the covenant, that the law, which is 430 years afterwards, cannot disannul. So the reason why we know it's talking about the birth of Jacob is the argument that Paul's making about it being a seed, not seeds. Because look what happened with Abraham. Okay, first Abraham's name was Abram, which means exalted father. Okay, and Abram was given this promise that he's going to have a seed, a child that will be his heir, that will inherit the land, and his offspring will be like the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore and so forth. So Abram agrees and believes God, and God accredits to him as righteousness. So Abraham receives this promise by faith. Okay, and so that's the covenant that we just read that was made earlier. It's the covenant of faith. And that covenant cannot be disannulled by what happened at Mount Sinai in the giving of the law. Okay? The covenant of faith transcends it. The covenant of the law can't undo the covenant of faith. All right? So after the covenant of faith, this is where Abraham kind of stumbles a little bit. Abraham, on the advice of his wife, decides to try to have a child through a maidservant by the name of Hagar. And Ishmael is born. Okay? So now we got a problem because Ishmael is not the son of Sarah. God's promise was that Sarah was going to have a son, okay, with Abraham, and that would be the heir. That would be the promised seed. Abraham didn't really act in faith in the conceiving of Ishmael, all right? So the problem is that God originally said the heir to Abraham would be his seed, not seeds, not many. Okay, he's not going to have multiple heirs to the land. So he can't have Ishmael and other kids. If Ishmael's not the promised seed, because he's not a son of Sarah, he's not from their proper marriage union, okay, then Ishmael cannot be the heir. But if Abraham was only told he was going to be given one seed, then how can Ishmael inherit anything? What's going to happen to Ishmael, okay? Because God never talked about seeds, plural. He only talked about one seed, and it's not Ishmael. Okay, so what happens next? What happens next is God changes Abraham and Sarah's name. Now, instead of being exalted father, he calls him Abraham, which is father of many nations. And in many nations they be blessed through faithful Abraham. Okay, so Abraham is still going to have a promised seed, But Ishmael will receive a blessing and his descendants, and many nations will receive blessings because of the mercy of God, basically. But Ishmael is still not the promised seed, okay? That's still not the confirmation of that original covenant. The covenant isn't confirmed and set until that promised seed shows up on the scene. Well, so then you might think, well, it must be Isaac. Well, there's only one problem with that, though. God changed Sarah's name, too, so that she would be the mother of basically many nations, from Sarai to Sarah. So there still has to be another nation that is not the promised seed that comes through the line of Sarah, okay? So if Sarah is old and she can only have one child, she ends up having Isaac, there still has to be one more child in that line before the promised seed shows up that's not the promised child, okay? So therefore we have the birth of Esau. And then we have the birth of Jacob. Now finally you've got an heir that's the promised seed from both Abraham's line and Sarah's line that is the promised child that can inherit the land. This is the confirmation of the covenant. So what we have here is the birth of Jacob is the confirmation of that covenant. It's the manifestation of that original promise that he would have a seed, an heir. And you can see that Jacob is the heir of the promised land because Jacob becomes Israel, and that land is Israel. It's not Isaac, it's not Edom, it's not Esau, it's not Ishmael, it's Israel. Israel is the promised seed, not seeds. Israel is the heir to that covenant, okay, for that land. So the showing up of the birth of Jacob is the confirmation of that original covenant that he would have a promised seed, a promised heir. And it's 430 years after the birth of Jacob that we have the law, the Exodus. So we know that Jacob went into the land of Egypt when he was 130. And if the law, the Exodus, is 430 years afterwards, then that tells us that the time that they were in Egypt was 300 years. Okay, so therefore that's how we get 300 years. And when we plug that into our chronology, that also makes the other part of the prophecy of the 400 years of affliction work perfectly. Because when you're in Egypt for 300 years, then the time of the affliction from the time that Jacob starts serving Laban until the time that they conquer and divvy up the land under Joshua is exactly 400 years. So that's how we know that the time that they were in Egypt was exactly 300 years, because the birth of Jacob is the confirmation of that covenant. So just to review, our 8th puzzle piece, the time that they were in Egypt was 300 years, and so we add 300 years to our where we were before in our chronology at 2270. Now we're at the year 2570 after creation for the time of the Exodus. So we're getting pretty far down the line. Let's go on to puzzle piece number 9. Now, the 9th puzzle piece is another very simple one. It basically is the verse from 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, and it states, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." Okay? And so, very, very simple puzzle piece. From the Exodus until the 4th year of the reign of Solomon, when he began to start building his temple, is 480 years. So all we got to do, based on that verse in 1 Kings 6:1, is add 480 years to our prior point along the chronology. We were at 2570 after creation. So add 480. We're now at the year 3050 after creation. That is the 4th year of Solomon's reign. That's the year that he began to build the first temple. So a very simple puzzle piece. Now let's go on to puzzle piece number 10. So puzzle piece number 10, another very simple one. This is the time that it took for Solomon to build the temple, which is 7 years. So from the 4th year of Solomon's reign until when he started the temple to the completion of the temple, we have a period of 7 years. And we can read about this in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 38, where it says, "And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, was the house finished throughout all the parts thereof, and according to all the fashion of it. So was he 7 years in building it. So it was 7 years from the time he started till the time of completion. So our 10th puzzle piece, another easy one, 7 years to complete the temple. So from our prior point on the chronology of 3050, we had 7 years. Now the temple, Solomon's temple, was completed 3,057 years after the creation of the world. So let's move on to piece number 11. Now puzzle piece 11 can be actually very complicated or very simple if we look at it another way and use a little bit of math. So this is the total time, or the total number of years before the Babylonian captivity begins. But the question is the total number of years starting at what point? So I would suggest to you that the starting point here is the completion of the Temple of Solomon, which we just discussed about in our puzzle piece number 10. That there's 420 years from the completion of Solomon's temple until basically the last year before the start of the Babylonian captivity. A total time frame of 420 years before captivity. Okay, so where do I get this from? Well, the long way to do it is to use the books of Kings and Chronicles and go through and compare all the years of the dates of the reigns of the kings listed in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, and then the same ones listed in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then juxtaposition them two on a graph so that you can come up with the number of years that it gives for that time frame. I've done this, and I have a spreadsheet, and you can see I actually have the entire chronology of the whole world, according to the Bible, on the spreadsheet. But as we progress through this part, this is the complicated way of doing it. You can go through the Bible, through the books of Kings and Chronicles, and begin to add up the kings of the kingdom of Judah and the reigns of the kings of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and arrive at the date at which the Babylonian captivity finally begins. So that's the long way to do it. But I did do it, and I determined the proper chronology, and I came up with the date that the captivity actually began. I'm going to show you now the short way, the easy way to do the same thing. But we have to start with the assumption that the start date for this is the completion of Solomon's temple. And I'll show you why it has to be the completion of Solomon's temple, because it's the only date that works with the reckoning of certain verses. So the key verses that we're going to use here are out of Chronicles and out of Ezekiel. So let me go first to the verse in Chronicles, which is chapter 36, verse 21. So let's go there now. So we'll do, I'm sorry, it's 2nd Chronicles, not 1st Chronicles. Just one moment here. Okay, in 2nd Chronicles, chapter 36, verse 21, it's talking about the 70-year Babylonian captivity that is about to come upon the nation of Israel. And verse 21 says, "To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths, for as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years, or 70 years. Okay, so Jeremiah had given a prophecy to the kingdom of Judah, to the remaining Jews in the land of Israel, that they were going to go into captivity. They were going to be taken into captivity into the nation of Babylon, and they were going to be stuck there serving the Babylonians for a period of 70 years. So what 2nd Chronicles chapter 36 verse 21 says is the reason for the time frame of 70 years is to allow the land to enjoy her Sabbaths, because apparently they weren't letting the land have sabbatical years. And so the way this works is, in the book of Leviticus, it was told to the Israelites as part of the covenant given down at Mount Sinai through Moses, that they were supposed to work their land, work their fields and their crops for 6 years, and every 7th year let the land rest. This was like a form of crop rotation. You would just let the land lay fallow and kind of restore itself. And then you could work it again for another 6 years and then do the same thing. So every 7th year, they were supposed to let the land rest. Apparently, they weren't doing that. Okay? And so, because of that, each one of those missed Sabbaths, God was keeping track, and he was going to allow the land, while they're taken into captivity in Babylon, to rest and enjoy her Sabbaths, according to this verse we just read. So, the question is, how do we get 70 years of Sabbaths? Okay. If Israel had not been keeping Sabbaths for a period of 420 years, okay, that means that they're missing 60 years, or 60 total Sabbaths. All right, so let's do the math on that to show you what I'm talking about. Okay, if you got 420 years, okay, and how many sets of 7 years are there in 420? Okay, so we'll divide it by 7. That's 60. Okay, for every set of 7 years, there's a missed Sabbath. So for over the course of 420 years, you've got 60 missed Sabbaths that they have to make up for. Okay, but the problem is that they, even though they missed 60 Sabbaths, they also worked during each of those years. So if we add up each of those years that they were working a Sabbath, every 7 years you're owed another Sabbath. Okay, so there's a number of ways you can kind of do the math in this, but basically to get to 70 years, all right, one way we can look at it is, okay, 60 years in the land, and then for the 60 years, that's 6 sets of 6 years, okay, 10 sets of 6 years, and each of those 10 sets deserves a Sabbath, because 6 years of work and the 7th year is a rest. So we add another 10 Sabbaths for the 10 sets of 6 years. I'll do it this way. 60 divided by 6. So every 6 years, we get a Sabbath. So there's 10 missing Sabbaths, right? So 60 plus 10 is 70. That's where you get 70. It's a little complicated, but basically, if they didn't keep Sabbaths for 420 years, okay, then there's 70 total Sabbaths that is owed to the land. Another way we could do it, a simple way we can do it, is we'll just divide this by 6, okay? Because every 6 years, you're owed a Sabbath. So 420 divided by 6, there's 70 years. Okay, 70 Sabbaths. So any way you do the math, the point is that if they didn't keep the Sabbaths for 420 years, there was 70 years that the land should be allowed to rest to catch up all those missed Sabbaths. Okay, that's the proper amount. So that is the point of this verse in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 21. It says, to fulfill the word of the Lord of Jeremiah, who given this prophecy that they were going to basically go into captivity for 70 years. It says, to fulfill the word of the Lord of Jeremiah, by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths, for as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, a full 70 years. So the fact that that's 70 years worth of Sabbaths, that's how we know that the time they didn't keep it was 420 years, because that's what warrants 70 years worth of Sabbaths. Okay, so we know that from the time they went into captivity to the start of this period that they weren't keeping Sabbaths, or at least for keeping track of it, is 420 years. But how do we know that goes back to the 4th year, or to the 11th year of Solomon's reign, when he completed the temple? Well, for that, we have to look at another prophecy in the book of Ezekiel. And I'll go there now. Okay, so Ezekiel is given this prophecy where he's supposed to lie on his side for 390 days, and each day is going to represent a year, and that's going to be the time of the transgression of the house of Israel, the northern kingdom, okay? And then he's to do the same thing for 40 days to represent the transgression of the number of 40 years for the house of Judah, the southern kingdom. All right, so we'll read it here in verse 4. It says, lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon it, thou shalt bear their iniquity. For I have laid up for I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days. So 390 years of iniquity is what it's representing. 390 days, so shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. That's the northern kingdom, okay? And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed each day for a year. So it's 40 years for Judah. So 390 years for the house of Israel, the northern kingdom, 40 years for the house of Judah, the southern kingdom. So let's go back to my chart that I showed you earlier here. All right. So this is the reign of Solomon that I'm showing you here. And the temple is completed in year 11 of his reign. But what happens after the reign of Solomon is there's a civil war. There's a division of the land of Israel into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And those two kingdoms would last for many, many years, centuries, in fact. Okay? So, the start of the northern kingdom, okay, if we count that down 390 years, okay, that leads us to the exact same day as 420 years, or the exact same year, as 420 years after the completion of the Temple of Solomon. Okay? So that's how we know that the completion of the Temple of Solomon is the starting point for the calculating of the missed Sabbaths, because it corresponds to the 390-year prophecy with Ezekiel. But what about the 40-year prophecy? Because Israel, that kingdom started about the same time. Okay? Well, if we, there's a number of ways we can do that. One is that we can back this up an additional 40 years for the reign of Solomon. But that idea I don't really necessarily like, because David reigned for 40 years before that, and so that doesn't really seem to me the start point. I think the reason, and even so, why wouldn't there be an additional 390 years for the nation of Judah, or for the kingdom of Judah, if that was the case? Why not? Why combine them like that? So I don't really believe that that's the case. Instead, the reason for the 40 years for the kingdom of Judah, if we keep scrolling down on the chart here, what we'll see is that when we get to 40 years before that date, that year of the start of the captivity, what we're going to find is that there's a description in the Bible where in the reign of the king of Josiah, they basically like find the book of the law, and they have this wonderful Passover, and it says they've never had a Passover like that Passover. I mean, it was like this phenomenal, wonderful Passover. And so I think God honored that Passover as an act of forgiveness for their iniquity up until that point. Okay? But then, for the next 40 years, they're still committing iniquity. So that 40 years brings us again to the time of the captivity, from that Passover until the time of the captivity. And so that 40-year period is the 40 years of iniquity that I think Ezekiel is accounting for by lying on his side in that prophecy that we just read. So again, that takes us to the exact same year. The same year that's 420 years after the completion of the temple. That's 390 years after the start of the northern kingdom. And that's 40 years after that Passover that's celebrated in the days of Josiah. It all leads to the same date. So that's how we know that the starting point for our 420-year prophecy must be the completion of the temple under the reign of Solomon. So that gives us our 11th puzzle piece, which is the total years before Babylonian captivity begins, which is 420 years. And again, this is from Ezekiel 4, verses 5 through 6, and 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 21. So in our chronological timeline, we were at 3,057 years at the completion of the temple under Solomon. We're going to add 420 years to bring us up to the Babylonian captivity. So that brings us to 3,477 years after creation before the Babylonian captivity starts. Okay? So that's where we are on the timeline. Now let's go to puzzle piece number 12. So our 12th puzzle piece, we're going to make it real simple again. It's the Babylonian captivity. And we'll even use the same, there's a number of verses we could use, but we'll use the same verse that we just used, which was 2 Chronicles 36:21, which describes that the time period of the captivity, according to the word from Jeremiah, is 70 years. But you can find that same verse examples in Jeremiah chapter 25. You can find it in Daniel chapter 9. There's plenty of examples where you can see that the Babylonian captivity lasted for 70 years. But we'll go ahead and use the 2 Chronicles verse since we've already referenced it. So the Babylonian captivity lasts 70 years. And so very simply, we were at 3477 before. We're adding 70 years on our timeline. So now the end of the Babylonian captivity is 3,547 years after creation. So this is going to get a little bit complicated when I kind of look at the Babylonian captivity a little bit. So I'm going to go back to that a little bit later because I want to kind of wrap up the puzzle pieces, just to kind of show you where we're at, and then I'll go back and talk a little bit about the Babylonian captivity. But suffice to say, 3547 after creation is the year that I have for the end of the Babylonian captivity. I believe that this is what is being referred to in Daniel chapter 9. Now, there's kind of some phases to the end of the Babylonian captivity, the same way there's some phases to the start of the Babylonian captivity, because when the Israelites were taken out of Israel, out of Judah, and taken into captivity, it actually happened in 4 waves. First, Daniel was taken, and then you had, later on, you had King Jeconiah was taken. And then after that, you had the burning of the temple, and more people were taken. And then after that, a commander in the 23rd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar comes along, and by the name of Nebuzaradan, and he takes the last captives out of the land. So that to me is the starting point, because that's when finally everyone's out of the land. That's the start of the 70 years. But likewise, with the return, that doesn't exactly happen all at one time, because you have a return in the first year of Cyrus, but then you also have a time period where they're not allowed to build the temple a little bit until the second year of Darius. And so Daniel chapter 9 is taking place in the first year of Darius. And in Daniel chapter 9, that's when he receives from an angel the information that the commandment was given now to restore and rebuild Jerusalem and so forth. At that point, the commandment goes forth. So that's kind of the end point that I see for the Babylonian captivity, even though it's a little bit after the first year of Cyrus, and I'll explain how that works out. It's the point where they can actually get going to start building the temple again, and that starts actually officially in the second year of Darius. So there's some little bit of play in how this works out with the captivity. Excuse me, but suffice to say, we're looking at that's the rough time frame with the 70 years, starting after the last wave of captives are taken by Nebuzaradan, and then ending with around the first and the second year of Darius, when you have the prophecy given in Daniel chapter 9, and then the restarting of the building of the temple in the second year of Darius, as described in the book of Ezra. So I won't go into all that now. I'm going to go on to the next puzzle piece, but I just kind of want to give you a slight breakdown before I go into that further later on. So let's go to puzzle piece 13. So now we've reached our 13th puzzle piece, and this is the infamous 70 weeks prophecy found in Daniel chapter 9, one of the most misunderstood chapters of the Bible, in my opinion, and the one that gets probably misapplied worse than perhaps many of the other chapters in the Bible. So Daniel chapter 9 gives a discussion about a specific prophecy pertaining to the temple that is going to be rebuilt after the Babylonian captivity ends. And Daniel is receiving this prophecy at the end of the 70-year Babylonian captivity. And it says in the prophecy that this is taking place in the first year of the reign of Darius. Okay, so let's take a look at that prophecy. So what we read in Daniel chapter 9 verse 1 is that in the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which is made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years whereof the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. And I set my face unto the Lord God to seek prayer and to seek by prayer and supplications with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. And I prayed unto the Lord my God, and made my confession, and said, O Lord, the great and merciful God, keeping the covenant of mercy to them that love him, and to them that keep his commandments, and so on and so forth. So he begins to pray a prayer of repentance, okay, realizing, so what's going on here? Daniel's praying a prayer of repentance, realizing, because he read about the time frame of the captivity in the books of Jeremiah, that the time frame of the captivity is supposed to be 70 years. He's at the end of the 70 years. You know this because, for one thing, the king that he's under now is Darius. He's a Persian king. And it's the Persians that came in and ended the Babylonian captivity. Okay? So we know we're at the end of the captivity. But the problem is, when it says the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, which Darius is this? It says he's of the seed of the Medes. So this is a famous person called Darius the Mede, and there's been a lot of attempts to try to identify who is Darius the Mede in history, because the Dariuses that we have in history were all Persians, okay, not Medians. Now, the Medo-Persian Empire is just that. It was made up of the Medes and the Persians, but what happened was the Medes were controlling things for the first part of the empire, and then the Persians kind of threw off their rule and took over and controlled the second half. They came up later, and they were kind of the kings after. So the Dariuses were all from the Persian line. So what is this Darius the Mede? And which Darius are we talking about? Because there's several Dariuses in the Persian chronology. Well, there's a couple clues we can use to figure out which Darius we're referring to here. The first is that this Darius is the son of Ahasuerus. Okay? So Ahasuerus, it can be shown etymologically in the Hebrew, comes from Xerxes or possibly Artaxerxes. But more than likely than not, it comes from Xerxes. Okay? So, whoever this Darius is, he's the son of either Xerxes or Artaxerxes. Okay? Which means it cannot be a figure by the name of Darius the Great, because Darius the Great was never the son of an Ahasuerus, or never the son of a Xerxes or an Artaxerxes. His sons were Xerxes, and his grandson was Artaxerxes, but he himself was not the son of a Xerxes or Artaxerxes. So it can't be Darius the Great, Darius the First. Darius the Second, however, is the son of an Artaxerxes and the grandson of a Xerxes. So Darius the Second would be our most likely candidate to fit. Now, there is also a Darius the Third that shows up on the scene later on, but he happens way too late in the chronology to be effectual, and I'll show you why in a moment here. Let's look at the next chapter of Daniel. We see that in Daniel chapter 10, verse 1, it says, In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name is called Belteshazzar. Okay. When we go to the next chapter, all right, an angel's talking to him, and he's continuing the conversation that began in the prior chapter, in the 3rd year of Cyrus. And the angel is saying, Also I, in the 1st year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. Okay? And now I will show you the truth. There shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his great strength and his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Okay? And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others besides those. Okay, so here's what's going on here. He's saying that there's going to be 3 more kings in Persia, and then a 4th that's greater than them all, and he's going to go to war against Greece. And the king of Greece is going to come and conquer. He's going to be great, but he's going to be cut off, and his kingdom will be divided into 4 parts, and those 4 parts won't be given to his posterity. They'll be given to others. Okay? So this can only be Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great is the empire, the Greek empire, the leader that went to war with the Persians and conquered them, and then died early, and his kingdom was divided between his 4 generals into 4 parts. So Alexander the Great is the Greek king that's being talked about here. So, getting back to the first part of this, it says that there's 3 more kings that will stand up in Persia, and a 4th greater than them all that will stir up the whole realm of the Greeks. Based on that chronology, that makes it that the only Darius that fits, this Darius the Mede, has to be Darius II, because after Darius II, there were 4 more Persian kings until Alexander the Great, which is exactly what this prophecy is saying. So we definitely are talking about Darius II, because Darius II was the son of an Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, and he was also the Darius that preceded the 4 last remaining kings of the Persian Empire before Alexander the Great took over. So we can clearly see from Daniel chapter 9 and chapter 10 that Darius the Mede, being talked about here, is Darius II. There's no question about it. But the problem is, Darius II was the son of Artaxerxes, okay? Artaxerxes is a Persian, and he's the son of Xerxes, and Xerxes is a Persian, and going all the way back. So if Darius II is the son of Persians, why are they calling him of the seed of the Medes? Okay. Well, what's interesting is that Darius's mother was a Babylonian woman. Okay. And so that's what they would do in those days. They would, you would intermarry between different kingdoms to solidify your kingdom. You would, royalty would exchange and give in marriage with royalty from other nations in order to form alliances. Okay. So in the case of Babylon, the Babylonian royalty came through a alliance originally with the Median Empire, because what had happened was, way back in the day, the father of Nebuchadnezzar made an agreement with a Median king that they would give the Medians would give their daughter to the Babylonians to be a wife to Nebuchadnezzar, so that they would solidify an alliance between those 2 nations. And so Nebuchadnezzar married a Median woman. That means that their offspring, their royal offspring of the Babylonians, were from the house of the Medes. So Darius II, if he was born from a Babylonian woman, has a claim to the Median throne, as well as being a claim to the Persian throne because his father was Persian. So Darius of the seed of the Medes is basically exemplifying the fact that he has a claim to not only the Persian throne, but also the Median throne through his Babylonian offspring, or heritage rather, which comes from the offspring of the Median Empire. See how that works? So that's why they call him Darius the Mede. All right? At least that's my opinion anyway. So, having said that, we now know who Darius is in Daniel chapter 9. So let's go back to Daniel chapter 9. So it says in Daniel chapter 9, in the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus. So if Darius here is Darius II, okay, the question is, when is his first year? Now, we know from the time period of things that were going on at this time that there was a great kind of civil war or upheaval that was occurring around the beginning of the reign of Darius. Because what had happened was, there was a king named Artaxerxes who passed before him, and then his brother, the son of Artaxerxes, the brother of Darius the second, was a guy by the name of Xerxes the second, rather. So Xerxes the second tried to claim the throne first, but then a guy came along by the name of Sogdianus, another member of their royal lineage, and he overthrew Xerxes the first. And then Darius the second, he's vying for the throne too, and he overthrows Sogdianus. So there's kind of a lot of strife going on here. Okay. Basically what you got is some civil war and some rebellions, and then in addition to that, because all this uncertainty with who's inheriting the throne, you have uprisings within the kingdom, and Darius has to go and put them down. Okay. Some of those uprisings occur in Babylon. All right. So if we read about certain of these uprisings that occur in something called the Behistun inscription that may apply, in my opinion, to Darius II as opposed to Darius I. And I have reasons which I can explain in another video why I believe that. That would indicate that there is a 2-year period, roughly, where Darius has to consolidate the kingdom before he finally can claim total kingship. So during this time period, they may be calling this the kingdom, the time of the kingdom of Cyrus, because there really is no set king, if you will. There's just people vying for the throne, and then 2 years later, finally, you have the first year of Darius II. This is one possible scenario that I'm kind of looking at. But the point being is that the first year of Darius II's reigns, his reign may not begin until the year 421 BC, because he spends a couple years trying to consolidate power and trying to claim the throne. Okay, so if 421 BC is the first year of the reign of Darius II, okay, then 490 years from that point, we come to 70 AD, which is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So knowing that, let's look at the prophecy that occurs at the end of Daniel chapter 9. All right. So in Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 25, we read, an angel's talking to Daniel, and he's explaining this to him. He says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troubled times." So, first thing I want to point out here, when did the commandment come forth to restore and rebuild Jerusalem? Well, if we back up a few verses here, again, what's going on in chapter 9 is Daniel is praying this prayer of repentance at the end of the 70-year captivity, and basically repenting for what caused them to go into captivity in the first place. And so an angel shows up on the scene, and then we pick this up in verse 21, and the angel says, "Yea, while I was," Daniel says, "Yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel," that's the angel, excuse me, "even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me at the time of the evening oblation. And he informed me and talked to me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to show thee, to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth." Okay? So Daniel's supplications are starting in the first year of Darius the Mede, or Darius II, in my opinion. So that's when the commandment comes forth. All right? So that's the start point of this prophecy. That's the beginning of the commandment. So let's keep reading. All right. "At the beginning of thy supplications the commandment came forth, and I am to show thee that thou art greatly beloved, therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. 70 weeks, again, starting from now, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision of the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy." Okay. 70 weeks are talking about sets of 7 years, those sabbatical years we were talking about earlier. So 70 sets of 7 years is 490 years. Keep that in mind. Okay, so verse 25. "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment," again, when did the commandment come forth? Right now, right when the angel is speaking. He says, at the beginning of the supplications of Daniel, the commandment came forth. And this is taking place in the first year of Darius the Mede, or Darius II. Okay. "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. After 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself." Some versions translate that as have nothing, instead of not for himself. But that's neither here nor there. Okay. "And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end wars and desolations are determined." All right. Couple things here. Number one, a lot of people want to try to apply this to meaning this is referring to Jesus as the Messiah. Okay. Jesus himself, even though Jesus is the Messiah, okay, that's not what's being talked about here. And Jesus himself indicates that, because He says in one of his prophecies, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation talked about by Daniel the prophet, okay, he's talking about something that's going to happen as a future event, all right? That's when all this, the cutting off of the Messiah and so forth happens. So it's something that doesn't happen until the temple gets destroyed in 70 AD, and Jesus himself refers to that. So we're not talking about Jesus as the Messiah here, because the word Messiah in Mashiach, if you will, in Daniel here, can simply mean something that is anointed. It doesn't necessarily mean the Messiah. It could be anything that's anointed. So I don't want to try to take things and force them to mean something they don't when they don't in certain verses, okay? That's not to say Jesus isn't the Messiah. It's just saying that this particular verse isn't talking about that. All right? And it tells you what it's talking about. It says, in verse 24, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision of the prophecy and to anoint, that's Mashiach, that's the anointing of the oil of the most holy, okay? That's the temple it's talking about. That's the temple that Daniel's praying that they're going to be allowed to start rebuilding, okay? He's talking about a 490-year period for this temple, all right? He says, know therefore and understand, going on to verse 25, that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. Okay, so some people would apply that to think that that's talking about Jesus the Messiah, okay? No, it can't be, because it's saying there's 49 years, okay, from the start point of this prophecy until the Messiah, the Prince, the anointed Prince, all right? And then there's 62 weeks that the street shall be built again and the wall even in troubled times, and after 62 weeks the Messiah shall be cut off. Okay, that's 434 years. So 49 years after the start of this prophecy, you have the anointed prince, and then 434 years later, the prince gets cut off. The prince is living 434 years. How does that work? It's not talking about an earthly prince. We wrestle against powers and principalities. The princes, when it used the word prince in the book of Daniel, it's talking about spiritual forces. It's talking about the principality that's going to be created in 49 years, where the Israelites will have a degree of autonomy. There'll be a principality that they'll be protected and living under all the way up until the time of the destruction of the temple. And then that principality will be taken away when Michael stands up, okay? And there'll be a time of great trouble, and then all the Israelites will be scattered into the diaspora throughout all the nations under the Roman Empire, okay? That's what this is talking about, because earthly princes don't live 434 years, all right? So it talks about, I'll give you another proof text, okay? In the next chapter, when it says that in the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, thing was revealed in Daniel. Okay, Daniel was praying and fasting and so forth for like 3 weeks, and so we go down to verse 13. This angel shows up, okay, and the angels explain to him. He says, "Then he said unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thy heart to understand and to chasten thyself before God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. But the prince of Persia," this is an angel talking, okay, "but the prince of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael," and Michael is an archangel, okay? Michael's one of the chief princes, it says here. But Michael's an archangel. It says, "But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia." Okay? So there's, again, we mentioned earlier, there's kind of warfare going on between all the kings during this time frame. Because there's not just one king, there's multiple kings vying for the throne of Persia. All right, so the princes that they're talking about are not earthly princes. They're principalities, they're angels. Okay, the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece. Okay, that's these are angels, and that's why you can have a period that's 434 years being described in Daniel chapter 9. All right. So knowing that, let's take a look at this prophecy again from a different mindset. All right. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. So what he's saying is that in 49 years is when you're going to get a principality, a degree of autonomy. Not necessarily a nation in the sense you're going to have a king, but you're going to have a restored city of Jerusalem. You're going to have a restored temple. You're going to have basically the start of some degree of autonomy, again, in 49 years, or 7 sets of 7 weeks, okay? So, know therefore and understand from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and then 62 weeks, that's 434 years, all right? The street shall be built again in the wall, even in troubled times. This happens during the appearance of Nehemiah, all right? Nehemiah is the one that shows up on the scene in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. He builds the walls. Even in troubled times, he rebuilds the gates and all that kind of stuff, and allows the city of Jerusalem to be rebuilt. Nehemiah shows up in the 20th year of Artaxerxes II. And the reason I know this is because Nehemiah shows up after the return of the captivity, after they've already gone back and they're going to rebuild the temple and everything else. And so if the end of the captivity is in the first year of Darius II, then the first possible Artaxerxes after the fact is Artaxerxes II. Okay? Now, Artaxerxes II, his 32nd year is exactly 49 years after 421 BC, after the start of this prophecy that we're seeing. Okay? In the story of Nehemiah, we see that Nehemiah built the walls of Jerusalem for 12 years, and then he finished the gates in like 52 weeks, okay? Or 50-some weeks or something like that. But the point is that he takes 12 years to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He goes back to the king, reports to him that he basically finished the job, and then he returns again, and he does some cleansing of the temple, kicking out some people that shouldn't be living there and so forth. But when he returns, that's the official, okay, everything's done. You've completed the task. The walls are rebuilt. Now they have their city. They have their walls. It's the starting of the principality of Jerusalem, of the nation of Israel again, all the way up until it's destroyed under the Romans in 70 AD. So this happens, this completion date happens when Nehemiah comes back and you have the start of this principality. This happens 49 years after this prophecy. And that's what they're talking about here. It says that, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince, till the anointed Prince, shall be 7 weeks, which is 49 years, and 62 weeks, the street and the wall should be built again, even in troubled times. That's talking about what happens under Nehemiah. Okay. After 62 weeks, this is where it gets a little interesting. After 62 weeks, the anointing, the Messiah, shall be cut off, but not for himself, or it shall say it shall have nothing. Okay? And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. All right? When was the sanctuary destroyed? It's destroyed in 70 AD. Okay? That's when the temple is destroyed. All right. So what's going on here is taking place 7 years before the destruction of the temple, because this is the last week of Daniel. It says, okay, so after 62 weeks, so you got a total of 69 weeks here, or 483 years. All right. So this brings us up to 63 AD approximately. All right. So after 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. So the anointing shall be cut off. The principality of Israel shall be cut off sometime after the year 63. Okay. And it says that the prince that shall come, this is the Romans, all right, will destroy the city and the sanctuary, which they did in 70 AD, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and to the end of the war, desolations are determined, all right? And he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. This is the final week, from 63 to 70, okay? So here's what's going on here. He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Okay. The war starts with the Romans halfway through that week. It starts around the year 66, okay, 67, and roughly in there, 66. All right. One of the reasons for the start of the war was they had stopped allowing sacrifices and offerings from the Gentiles at the temple. That's when the sacrifices and offerings ceased. They ceased halfway through the 7-week period. So it says, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. Okay, the overspreading of abominations. Okay, so here's what's happening at this point. Herod comes along. They had a mandate originally to go back under Darius and so forth. They had a mandate to go rebuild the temple, and the purpose of the temple, the reason why they're given this mandate originally, was to pray for the king of Persia and so forth. Okay, to pray to the God of Israel for the mercy upon the kingdom of Persia. All right, that's the reason why they're allowed to rebuild their temple. Okay, when they stopped doing sacrifices and offerings and so forth for the Gentiles, they ceased the very mandate that allowed them to build that temple in the first place under the Persians, which is to pray for the foreigners, if you will. Okay? So that basically broke their covenant. But in addition to that, it says, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Okay? And in the midst of the week, he shall make it desolate. So here's what happened during this time. The original temple that was built under a leader by the name of Zerubbabel, when they came back from captivity from Babylon, that temple stood for many, many, many years, all the way up until roughly about 18 years or so, I think, before Christ. Okay, then a ruler comes along by the name of Herod, and Herod gets the idea that he wants to tear down this temple and rebuild a bigger, better, grander version. Okay, this is Herod's remodeling of the second temple. So Herod is going to rebuild this great grand version, but the problem is that the original covenant under which they were allowed to build the original temple, under Darius and so forth, gave very specific dimensions as to how the temple should be laid out. And it says if anybody tears this temple down, let them be hung on a cross, let their house become a dunghill, and so forth. It gives some bad things that will happen, some curses, if anyone violates that covenant. Herod comes along, and he's going to tear down Zerubbabel's temple. He's going to build a big, grander, greater temple. The completion of that temple doesn't finally get done until around the year 63 AD. According to the historian Josephus, this is actually one of the big causes for the war with the Romans, because in 63 AD, all of a sudden, the construction of the temple is complete after all these years, and there's a whole bunch of able-bodied construction workers and so forth that are without a job, and they've got nothing better to do and no money other than to become rebellious and rise up against the empire and so forth. So Josephus says this is a great cause for the rebellion against the Romans. Okay, so this happens in 63 AD. In 63 AD is the confirmation of this covenant, okay, that occurs with not only the covenant with Darius that says if you tear this down, all these bad things are going to happen, but also the covenant that Herod gives that he's going to rebuild and complete this new temple for the people. Okay, this all completes in 63 AD. So he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. That's the stopping of the offerings for the Gentiles. And for the overspreading of abominations. This is both the Roman eagle, but I also suggest that this is possibly Herod's temple itself, because Herod's temple is not the same type of temple that Zerubbabel created. Herod's temple was a temple of pride. Herod's temple was this great grandiose thing that destroyed Zerubbabel's temple and overshadowed it with this massive larger temple that was basically a testimony to not to serving God, but to the pride of Herod. So in that sense, one might consider that Herod's temple itself is an abomination overspreading the temple of Zerubbabel. Okay? So, that being said, we can look at this prophecy now in a different light. It says, and he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abomination he shall make it desolate, even unto the end, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. talking about the desolation that's left after the temple is destroyed, the empty, wide open space of the Temple Mount that's left for years and years and years after the destruction of the Jewish temple. Okay, so if we start with 421 BC, the first year of Darius, as the start point, and we go 490 years, Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy perfectly plays out, because the culmination of this prophecy is the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the city. Okay? It says in verse 26, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay? They're given 490 years, Israel is, from the start of this prophecy, and at the end of it, the city and the temple is going to be destroyed. So that's another reason why we know that we're talking about 421 BC as the first year of Darius, the starting point of this. Okay. So with that in mind, it's a long kind of convoluted explanation, but from that we can get our 13th piece, which is the 70-week prophecy, which is 490 years. And so from the start of Daniel's prophecy in the first year of Darius, which is 421 BC, adding 490 years, we come to AD 70, which is exactly 437 years after the creation of the earth. So now we've got our key tie-in, because that ties it in with our modern date, and we can figure out exactly where we are in history based on the chronology of the Bible. And so all we have to do then is our last puzzle piece, which is adding the time from 70 AD until now to figure out what year we are in according to the Bible. So that brings us to our last puzzle piece, which is the time frame from 70 AD to the present year, which at the time of this video is the year 2018, which is a total of 1,948 years. So we simply add that to where we were on our time frame, which is 4037 plus 1948, and that brings us to the year 5,985. So that means right now we are at 5,985 years after the creation of the world. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. In ancient times, there's this concept where there would be 6,000 years of human history, just like there's 6 days and then a Sabbath day where you rest. The Bible says that a day to the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So you'd have 6,000 years of human history, and then a sabbatical millennium. And this concept of the millennium is talked about heavily in prophecy in the New Testament, okay, and in the Bible. So the 1,000-year reign of Christ would start after about 6,000 years of history, or maybe just before, somewhere around that time frame. But look at where we are on Bible chronology. Okay, we're at the year 5985, which means that the start of the 1,000 years of peace of the reign of Christ must be happening very soon and in our lifetimes. Okay, now maybe there's a 7-year tribulation beforehand. Maybe there's not. I mean, that's debatable as to what your eschatology is or study of the end times. But the point is that we're getting very, very close to what historically, from thousands of years ago, was to believe to be the time frame for the start of the reign of the Messiah. Okay, and all the omens and the prophetic pieces in our day and age are coming into play. That we can see that, like the return and the restoration of the nation of Israel after a couple thousand years. Okay, there's some big Bible prophecy that's playing out right now, and we know that we're getting very close to the time of the return of Christ. So that's why Bible chronology is very, very, very important. Now, I know this video is gotten very long. I'm already at an hour and 43 minutes or so. So there's some other things, some amazing things that I want to show once this whole chronology was laid out, that you can kind of understand this a little bit better. But for the sake of the time frame of this video, I'm going to probably do that in another video. But at least I was able to properly get down Bible chronology using those key 14 puzzle pieces so that you can piece this together to yourself to find out what the timeline of creation is. And what we find is that there are no inconsistencies in the Bible. There's only the appearance sometimes of inconsistencies, but when you work them out, there's great treasures once you discover the resolution to those inconsistencies. You find out that they're not inconsistencies at all, but rather what appears to be a contradiction actually hides behind it some great information, some great treasures of knowledge for those who are willing to take the time to dig. So, having said that, I basically only scratched the surface with the amount of information that I got into this as far as studies, but there's other things I want to show too. One of the amazing things I want to show is how astronomy backs up this chronology, and particularly some amazing things that are shown in the heavens, such as the Star of Bethlehem, or some amazing things that happen in the year of the creation of the earth in the skies, in the heavens. So, but I'll get into that in a little bit in another video. The important thing is I just wanted to give a basic breakdown of how you can come up with proper Bible chronology and show that the Bible consistently shows the age of the earth from the start to the end. But the most important thing I want to show is it means that Jesus is coming back very, very soon. I'll see you in the next video, and God bless.